And let me make you the presenter, and you should be good to go.
Right, do you see my weekly topics?
I do.
Very good, okay. All right, welcome everybody. Let me begin this discussion about protecting our schools. Uh, in earlier webinars in this series, we've been talking about tactics, techniques, concepts, individual training that are associated with armed self-reliance for the individual and for the defense of businesses, churches, and communities within the framework of the law. This discussion today is a little bit different because in most places in this country, we have a significant hurdle of law and perception and ideas that we have to overcome before we can get down to the specifics of how we might protect our schools. So let's first talk about threats. School attacks have been very common in the repertoire of Islamic terrorists outside the United States. From 1970 until 2013, there were nearly 4,000 incidents of terrorists targeting schools worldwide. Now, not all of these were perpetrated by Islamists, but many of the worst were. You see the long list of countries attacked in this fashion. But so that you don't take too much comfort from the fact that that Islamic terrorists have struck schools only so far outside the United States, let's consider this briefly. The reports from the San Bernardino event last year from that investigation noted an extensive collection of school photographs on Syed Farouk's computer, photographs that were not tied to or justified by his day job. Al-Qaeda has long publicly asserted what they consider their right to kill 2 million American children. Videotapes confiscated over a decade ago in Afghanistan showed Al-Qaeda terrorists practicing the takeover of a school. It's a long video. I believe you can still find a copy of it online. The trainees are seen to be issuing commands in English, separating youngsters into groups, shooting resistors, and taking others to the rooftop. Hung over the edge, shot, thrown off the roof. A document that was captured from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the direct precursor to ISIS, included detailed floor plans for schools in Virginia, Texas, and New Jersey. And there have been several incidents, well documented, of Middle Eastern males conducting trial runs on school buses in several locations around the United States. And then finally, there's the simple and incontrovertible logic of the situation, which is that most American schools, for reasons we'll discuss, are high value, high impact, soft targets, which makes them a fairly irresistible combination from the standpoint of a terrorist. Now, terrorism is clearly not the only threat, and certainly not the most likely or most probable threat to any of our schools on any given day. We've had shootings by mentally or emotionally disturbed individuals, occasionally, as at Columbine, 2 or a few more. These events occur frequently, but they're not common. They're still rather uncommon if we look at them from the nationwide perspective. But they work. They're effective because our schools are typically undefended by anyone on site, which gives the shooters several minutes of complete freedom to work their will on the inhabitants. This is the defining example of why gun-free zone equals unarmed victim zone. But looking briefly at some of the numbers, the raw numbers of shootings in U.S. schools, not all of them being mass shootings, which the FBI defines as 4 fatalities or more, but the raw numbers are 61 total in the 1990s, 59 in the 2000s, and 117 already from 2010 until now. We won't review the case studies. Everyone is probably fairly familiar with Columbine, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, and some of the other well-known school shootings. There is one interesting statistic that is worth looking at. The FBI commissioned a study of 160 active shooter incidents. Now, again, not all of them were mass shootings, and not all of them occurred in schools. But they found that the incidents ended when the shooter committed suicide in 40% of the cases, was shot by responding law enforcement in 28% of the cases, or was stopped by either unarmed or armed citizens. Only the last two categories represent a shooter being stopped before he was ready to stop. Police usually, almost always, arrive too late or intervene and take direct action too late after the killer has done killing. And armed citizens have not played a major role because shootings occur most frequently in gun-free zones where law-abiding citizens do not have weapons. So now let's back out of that threat discussion and think about how we can, within the current legal climate, undertake to protect our schools better. For most of our history, citizens carrying firearms was an area of social activity that was very unregulated. Even through most of the 20th century, firearms in schools were unregulated, and frequently there were marksmanship training programs, curricular, extracurricular, that ran without commotion and almost entirely without incident. The federal government understood its place, that regulating firearms in and around schools was outside of its purview. States didn't regulate the practice, and whatever laws did govern carry of firearms in any public place applied equally to schools. Now, according to the logic of the modern hoplophobe, the person afraid of firearms, it's amazing that our school hallways were not awash in blood everywhere, but they were not. All this changed in 1990 in still a breathtaking example of federal overreach. Congress passed, and President Bush, the senior, signed the Gun-Free School Zones Act in 1990. It was later amended in 1995 under President Clinton and remains in effect today. And broadly speaking, it prohibits the mere possession of a firearm within 1,000 feet of any school in America. The result of that federal law has been that active shooters of any sort are usually the only people armed in a school. We've had many, many deaths and injuries as a direct result of this self-imposed inability as a society to protect our children. There are several exceptions that are spelled out in the Gun-Free School Zone Act. The most significant is for possession by any person licensed by the state. This license has been identified in multiple courts to include both law enforcement officers and licensed private security officers. But it also may include concealed firearms or concealed carry permits issued by the state if the state's law explicitly authorizes these permittees to carry on school property. Now, you must note that unlicensed carry, such as open carry or constitutional carry without a state-issued permit, does not qualify for this federal exception. If a potential attacker knew that at any time in any school there were likely to be one or more persons present legally carrying a firearm, most would be deterred from ever acting. If the shooter is not deterred, having armed defenders on site will give our children and their educators a fighting chance. So the first question you must address in thinking about protecting our schools is a political one. Does your state authorize permitted concealed carry by citizens on school property under that exception which is provided in federal law? There are several states which do. For example, Utah, which has allowed any concealed carry permittee to carry anywhere on every K through 12 and college campus in the state for over 16 years now, during which time no one on school property in Utah has been shot by anyone for any reason. If your state does not allow concealed carry in schools by permittees, then perhaps the first thing that you ought to be looking at is to enter into the political process and attempt to change that. But there are other avenues that you can explore. Commissioned law enforcement officers are specifically exempted from the Gun-Free School Zone Act. But how many jurisdictions in these times can afford to assign even one full-time police officer to every school? And despite what is clearly a very real deterrent value of a uniformed officer on campus, how confident can we be that one officer who is uniformed and therefore easily identified is likely to have the training and the awareness and the sheer luck to survive a surprise attack that would probably make him the very first target? Armed security personnel who are specifically licensed by the state are also authorized under the federal Gun-Free School Zone Act. But all the disadvantages of the police officer apply. If a city or county government can't afford a police officer assigned to your school, then how is your school district going to pay for a full-time armed security guard in every school, and for his equipment, and for a level of training and readiness that would counteract those structural disadvantages we discussed on the last slide? Another drawback is that armed school resource officers, as they're usually called, often have other duties and responsibilities, each of which will detract from the vigilance, awareness, and reactiveness necessary to counter a sudden violent threat. In many, many cases, school districts who have armed school resource officers do not have far fewer than they would need to cover all of their schools. Typically, those officers spend most or all of their time in the high schools where drug issues arise and where violence of lesser sorts do occur from time to time. So school resource officers very seldom provide full coverage to the schools in a school district. And then finally, arming school staff is an approach that is being taken increasingly in various states and jurisdictions around the country. The idea here is that employees, teachers, administrators, support personnel can be authorized to be armed. Many school boards, administrators, educators, and parents are very, very uncomfortable with the idea of people unknown to them carrying firearms in their schools. Now, I would say that this is a sentiment. It's not a rational position, as concealed carry permittees are among the most law-abiding subset of the population. But it's a commonplace feeling, and it can be accommodated by allowing only school district employees to be armed with the knowledge and at the discretion of the administration. If, for instance, only 1 out of 10 school employees volunteer to obtain or already possess a concealed carry permit, if only 1 out of 10 are willing to discreetly and securely carry a firearm on their person and meet a specified training standard, the level of security in their school building would be far higher than in any gun-free zone. The picture you see on this slide is from a school in Oklahoma, where many school districts have in fact availed themselves of this possibility, offered them under state law. Regardless of how effective these armed staff members might be in a fight, and of course we would hope that they would be highly effective, but regardless of their level of training and readiness and ability in a fight, they would be far harder to detect and to target by any potential attacker, and therefore their deterrent value would be enormous. If you are legally armed on school property, either as a commissioned law enforcement officer, as a paid security guard, as a staff member, or even as simply an armed citizen with a concealed carry permit, you have an obligation to train and practice regularly, to maintain your situational awareness, to regain the initiative from any attacker by reacting swiftly and effectively, to move toward the sound of the gunfire to defend the innocent, which is a requirement that implies a very, very high level of moral courage and something more than most concealed carry permittees have initially signed on for. You would have an obligation to shoot well if shooting is necessary, and to make yourself hard to kill by proper application of speed, surprise, violence of action, use of cover and concealment, and the use of appropriate tactics. Defenders who can meet these standards will deter most potential attackers by their mere presence. They'll have a strong chance of defeating any attacker who is not deterred, or at the very least will delay him or disrupt his plans, enabling more potential victims to escape and buying time for law enforcement to arrive and intervene. Action like this will require a high level of moral and physical courage, but there's no more worthy cause. In local discussions in the political process where I hail from, I have heard more than one teacher avow that they're willing to do anything to defend our children, to stand up and to take a bullet in order to defend the children under their care. My observation was that level of courage is very admirable, but if you do not have the means to do so effectively, then you're simply offering your life first with no assurance that you will accomplish anything except a moment's delay. So, we will now move into a discussion of a historical scenario. We recognize that one or two active shooters are a far more likely threat in our schools, but we're going to focus here on a worst-case terrorist threat, less likely but most dangerous, and a specific example, which is the attack by Muslim Chechen terrorists on Beslan School Number 1 in the Russian Republic of North Ossetia in 2004. And then we'll look at how a Beslan-like scenario might develop differently in America, and then we'll look at our hypothetical scenario that illustrates the advantages of some of the forms of preparedness and defense that we here at Pulse recommend. The Beslan school siege lasted for 3 days. It occurred in the context of ongoing warfare between the Russian military and the independence movement in the adjoining Republic of Chechnya. The perpetrators were members of an Islamic terrorist organization with a prior history of attacks on Russian soil. Those smiling individuals in the pictures are members of that organization, though presumably not ones who were present at Beslan itself. The picture you see here is in fact the Beslan school after the conclusion of the siege. It was not a location that yielded a lot of photographic evidence or really entered into the attention of anyone outside of that community prior to this event. The school was seized on the opening day of school, September 1st, 2004. There were more than 1,200 people present, teachers, administrators, students, families with younger children, all present for the opening day ceremonies at the school. There are conflicting reports, widely varying reports on the total number of attackers. There's general agreement that a dozen or so drove up to the school that morning, but there were more inside the school or who joined them in the first minutes and hours of the siege. Most all commentators, including the official Russian post-incident investigation, agree that there were at least 50 in all, and estimates go as high as 100. Many of these additional people had been embedded previously in the local community and possibly even infiltrated into the school compound the night before the event. The attackers were armed with a wide range of small arms, assault rifles, belt-fed weapons, and other weapons, as well as significant amounts of explosives. They had rocket-propelled grenades. There were many reports suggesting, without confirmation because of the level of destruction in the school afterwards, that many of those weapons and explosives had been cached surreptitiously on school grounds prior to the event. They herded all the hostages inside the buildings, most of them into the school gymnasium. There was a very brief gunfight with local police at the outset, with a few casualties on both sides. There were some cell phone pictures that came out of the siege. This is an early one. This is the real thing. Explosives were wired in the gymnasium and throughout the school. They were variously activated by tripwires, by remote controlled devices in the hands of the terrorist leaders, and by dead man switches controlled by the attackers. In fact, the left-hand picture here shows one of those attackers with his left foot on a dead man switch controlling explosives in the gymnasium. Now, during the first hours of the siege, men and boys that were identified as capable of resistance were pulled out of the crowd, taken to another room in the building, and killed with explosives and gunfire. Their bodies were thrown out of the windows. Many female hostages, including young girls, were sexually abused. The entire school was fortified to resist attack from the outside. Security forces responded slowly because in this area of North Ossetia, there were no law enforcement or military units prepared for a counter-terrorist operation on this scale. Local civilians, however, many of them related to the hostages inside, and many of them armed, encircled the school. And throughout the 3 days of the siege, they refused most attempts at coordination or control by the authorities. Negotiators arrived within hours and continued to engage the terrorists in conversations, but to no effect. There were no clear demands delivered during the course of the siege, and no hostages were released. Killings of hostages inside the school continued throughout the siege. Those that survived those random killings were denied food and water and access to bathrooms. Their condition deteriorated steadily to the point where during the final assault, many of them were too weak to leave the school under their own power. By the third day, there was an assortment of Russian federal security forces, army troops, internal security forces, law enforcement organizations, special forces, which of course created a tremendous amount of confusion and uncertain command control. They were backed by T-72 tanks and armored personnel carriers, as you see in these pictures. And accounts differ of what happened on the morning of that third day, but gunfire began. It's unknown whether it started from the attackers inside the school, from the security forces on the perimeter, or from the armed and undisciplined civilians outside the school. But that gunfire was quickly followed by the detonation of some explosives inside the school, and of necessity, the security forces began an emergency assault, which was they were unprepared for. It was poorly planned and turned it rapidly into chaos. Heavy weapons, including tank cannon and incendiary and thermobaric rockets, were employed. Many of the attackers' explosives detonated. You're looking at a picture there. On the right side of the left-hand picture is the gymnasium where most of the hostages were still held. The entire roof of that building collapsed as a result of gunfire from outside and the detonation of the terrorist explosives on the inside. Hostages were caught in the crossfire and murdered intentionally by the attackers during the fight. The gunfight and resulting fires inside the school raged on for nearly 2 hours, and during it, an unknown number of attackers escaped the school entirely. Official reports indicate, and it took several years for the Russians to finalize these reports and satisfy them, the many observers, that they were accurate. But they indicate that 334 hostages, 186 of them children, were killed, most of them during the assault and the gunfight and the fires on that third day. 700 more were injured, and as many as 200 were never accounted for, missing or unidentified, usually because of the explosives and the intense fires. There were 10 or possibly a few more security personnel killed during the fight, including all 3 commanders of the assault group. 55 more were injured. The bodies of 31 attackers were recovered. It's unknown how many escaped the school, but fighting continued through the town and into the surrounding countryside for at least 12 hours as those escapees among the terrorists all got away. So, that is a very, very horrific example of what can happen when terrorism comes to school. Now, in America, our schools constitute a different target set in a lot of ways. We can certainly expect to see some differences in the way ISIS or any other Islamist terrorist organization would approach our target set versus what happened in Beslan in 2004. First, we would probably not see as large an attacking force, essentially because the likelihood of assembling a force that large, staging it, rehearsing, and right up to the point of execution, that larger force would dramatically increase the likelihood of their being detected and compromised before the attack could be executed. And then we would have to ask, why would they bother? Because against an unprotected school, or even one with a single armed officer, which is the best we can expect in most places in America, any group of 4 to 6 terrorists would be able to take absolute control very swiftly. If a larger number were in fact available, then probably from their point of view, the most effective tactic would be to target several schools widely distributed simultaneously. 3 or more cells of 4 to 6 operators each striking separate targets would stretch our very limited response capability very thin and would reap maximum effect, as no parent and no community would feel safe. Colonel David Grossman, in discussing this aspect of the threat, has pointed out that the day after an event like this, where multiple schools widely distributed had come under attack, very few children in America, of the many, many millions, would attend school the next day. Very few of their parents would be at work. They would be home caring for their children. The psychological and emotional impact would be multiplied by the economic impact. It's a potentially very, very effective tactic for our enemies. Now, many school districts with limited security resources, as I mentioned earlier, they tend to concentrate school resource officers or police officers in the high schools, where violent events and destructive behavior are more frequent. And as a result, it would make sense that terrorists, as they did at Beslan, will pick elementary schools or middle schools instead. And we talk about police response. In larger cities, or in schools that are embedded in smaller cities, in suburbs, in large towns, close to major population centers, police response can be fairly swift. So a very much more attractive target would be rural or small town schools that have limited police coverage and longer response times. The ability of most small town or county SWAT teams to engage 4 to 6 heavily armed, coordinated, fortified individuals is very questionable. And we need only look at the delayed response of large tactical teams to events involving only one shooter, for instance, the recent event in Orlando, to extrapolate what we might see in this instance. If the response is slow enough, it might even be possible for this smaller group of terrorists to do maximum damage and then escape or move toward another target, as the 2 shooters in San Bernardino did. The most attractive targets for terrorist planners would likely be in states with limited concealed carry, no hunting culture, little or no visible armed security in schools, and limited tactical response capability by local police organizations. This is unlikely to be seen in New York or Los Angeles or Dallas or other major metropolitan areas with large full-time SWAT teams and significant counterterrorism planning, because they are in fact best prepared to detect, disrupt, or react swiftly to such an attack. If you get away from those large urban areas, or the East and West Coast bases of the national level response elements, the effective response, the ability to actually assault and neutralize attackers this capable, could take many hours. And during all of that time, the event would be featured in the 24-hour media and on the internet, achieving saturation coverage and multiplying its effect. Death tolls could easily match or exceed those seen in Beslan and in other overseas incidents, with no more sophisticated means than a number of individual shooters with small arms and improvised explosives. no WMD would be required. So, with that as background, now we're going to zoom in on a hypothetical scenario and talk about what it could look like at one school. This is not necessarily the worst case or the most dangerous, but it is close to the most probable profile of a terrorist event. So first, the boundaries. We're only going to look at what might happen within the first few minutes. After that, law enforcement anywhere in America will be responding, perhaps slow, perhaps in small numbers, but they will respond in steadily increasing force, and they will take control of the situation. And because very unfortunately, their control may be limited to securing the scene with outer and inner perimeters and gathering intelligence. In most of America, again, the large, capable, highly trained counter-terrorist forces are hours away at best. The typical SWAT team outside of major urban areas is largely unprepared to deal with an organized group of well-armed terrorists. And state police or FBI regional teams take time to assemble, to reach an incident site, deploy, assimilate the tactical intelligence, and act, even if their attention is not split across multiple simultaneous attacks. So they do not figure into our scenario at all. Our children could be at risk for hours before any of those assets have any ability to intervene. So, today, we're looking at a generic small town in an upper Midwest Plains state, population a little over 27,000, with a farm service and light industry economy. The nearest city, over 100,000 population, is more than 180 miles away. Law enforcement capabilities locally, and I offer you this. This is based upon some research into towns of exactly these characteristics. This town has a police department of 41 armed officers, an average of a dozen on duty in any shift. It has a part-time SWAT team composed of patrol officer volunteers. They train together as a team, an average of 1 day a month. Their tactical experience is limited to occasional high-risk warrants and taking down the occasional meth lab. This is the county seat. 27 locally based sheriff's deputies patrol the rural areas of the county. The sheriff has a SWAT team, but his SWAT team is also part-time, composed of patrol deputies. Due to personality conflicts between the sheriff and the town's chief of police, these two teams do not train together. The nearest highway patrol district headquarters is 60 miles south, has responsibility for a 24-county area, and its 21 troopers are focused primarily on policing the interstate highway there, 60 miles to the south. So, here's our school. It is one of two public middle schools, grades 7, 8, and 9. Current enrollment is 448. The typical student-teacher ratio is 16:1. The school is only 2 years old, of reinforced masonry construction, and it has several modern security features. Exterior doors are routinely locked against unauthorized entry, with interior push bars to ensure safe exit in an emergency. The locks are remote controlled from the administrative offices, the brown area, number 16 on your diagram. An intercom system allows communication among all rooms and areas. Visitor entry during the day is through the main entrance, and from there directly into the administration offices where visitors sign in and are then permitted to proceed on legitimate business through the school. Other security measures. The school district has one armed school resource officer. As is often the case, he works out of an office in the high school across town. His presence in the middle schools and elementary schools is routine, typically once a month or as requested. But in this state, the state legislature about a year ago did in fact authorize school districts to allow employees with state-issued concealed carry permits to legally carry concealed firearms. This local district has solicited qualified volunteers and authorized carry by a total to date of 10% of the district's employees. At this middle school, 2 administrators, 2 classroom teachers, and 1 custodial employee are armed in accordance with state law and district policy. Their identities are closely held. They are not public information. Police have assisted in the drafting of the school's emergency response plan and the sensitive limited distribution response to active shooter annex. The police have conducted familiarization walkthroughs for officers, but there has never, in the 2 years the school's been open, been an incident requiring actual police response to the school. So, time 0, 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday, first week of September, the day after the Labor Day holiday. 2 vans showing the logo of the local utility company park on the curb near the main entrance. The 2 drivers, wearing coveralls with soft shoulder bags, approach the entrance, press the intercom button, speak to the receptionist who buzzes them through into the administrative office. Attacker number 1 pulls a short assault rifle from his bag, shoots the receptionist, moves around her desk toward the entry access controls. The second man empties a magazine through the internal windows into the adjacent workers' offices and then runs into the hallway that serves the classroom blocks. At the first sound of gunfire, 2 more men emerge from each of the vans, 4 total, and rush toward the entrance with heavy duffel bags. In the second minute of the incident, as the old Scotsman said, the best laid plans of mice and men go oft awry. As attacker number 1's attention shifts to the door remote control panel, an assistant principal arrives at the corner of the admin area hallway and opens fire with his handgun. Attacker number 1 drops to the floor, wounded. The 4 additional attackers, 3 through 6, they reach the front entrance to find it locked instead of opened. They pull assault rifles from their bags and commence shooting through the glass, which is reinforced by a security laminate film. It takes more than a minute to rake the broken glass out of the doorway, move through it, and then repeat at the internal office door. Alarms sound throughout the school, and a coded 911 call is sent as a panic button automatically locks all internal classroom and hallway doors. Attacker number 2 moves west into the commons area to escape the fire of his comrades at the main entrance, but he comes under fire from yet another armed offender, in this case an 8th grade teacher, emerging from the hallway of his classroom block, as you see on the diagram. Attacker number 2 returns fire with a long burst of automatic fire, but while doing so, he takes rounds from the school's daytime custodian, who appears behind him at the northeastern corner of the multipurpose room. He is now wounded and out of the fight. The custodian then moves across that short hall to a safer position, covering the entire north-south hallway. Attackers number 3 through 6 finally penetrate into the reception area, but they're disconcerted by inbound fire from at least 3 directions. They briefly exchange fire with the assistant principal, who retreats down the hall to avoid their return fire. Defender number 4 is a 7th grade teacher who posts near the east end of the long hallway. Defender number 5, the other assistant principal, posts in the west doorway between the admin offices and the long hallway, prepared to back up his partner behind him or control movement westward down the hall. We're now 4 minutes into the incident. During these first 4 minutes, in accordance with the school's emergency response plan, students have been evacuating, led by other teachers, toward identified rally points in covered locations off the property. This is in fact a controversial element of a response plan. It's a calculated risk that assumes that there are no additional shooters outside, but it's a common element in many school emergency response plans. And risks must be taken one way or another. So here, 5 minutes into the incident, let's look at what we have. The terrorist attackers have lost 1/3 of their original numbers. The delay caused by this unexpected resistance has disrupted their plan and allowed the majority of their intended victims to escape. Movement from their current location to any other portion of the school will draw fire from at least one of these armed defenders. Now, they still have an advantage in firepower. They may even have an advantage in training and team cohesion. They may well be able to advance and eliminate their opposition one or two at a time, but doing so will take time, risk further casualties among themselves, and fixate their attention on this fight inside just as the initial local police response may be arriving outside. So note the synergy between the informed design of the school with its controlled entry, the physical security technology in place, which is not uncommon in new school construction across America today, the security procedures and practices, and finally, of course, the presence of armed defenders. The absence of any one of these elements would make success in circumstances like this far less probable than what we've seen here. Now we can ask this: are we expecting, in this hypothetical scenario, are we expecting too much of our armed defenders? And I would suggest that no, we're not. None of them have engaged superior numbers. They've engaged and then retreated before superior numbers could come into play. With appropriate training, their handguns are effective within the ranges that they are engaging, so the disparity in weapons is not that significant. When they are confident that the school is evacuated, confidence that they may gain from the school's intercom system or from simple verbal communications, then they may choose to escape the building themselves. The precious cargo, the precious targets in that school are no longer in danger. They have no necessary requirement to remain and defend the physical plant. And thus far, their actions and positions have been planned and rehearsed. They're not random, and they're not made up on the spot. This is part of the school's emergency response plan with walkthroughs and rehearsals prior to the day. Have there been friendly casualties in this incident? Yes, there have, but far fewer than the attackers planned, and far fewer than they would have achieved in a school without armed defenders. Would an incident like this encourage further terrorist attacks on schools or deter them? Is this a victory or defeat for the terrorists? After an incident like this, would our schools across America be seen as hard targets, the sort that terrorists carefully avoid? And finally, would any other sort of potential active shooter be encouraged or discouraged by this outcome? We know that we have a very, very significant history of active shooter events in this country where the shooter he's not engaging in an impulse crime. He's not acting on impulse at all. He's planning his target and his actions with some degree of deliberation and research, and choosing targets where he is confident there will be no defenders on scene. So the first couple of incidents that resolve in anything like the way that we've seen here is likely to have an influence on such potential attackers. So at that point, we'll conclude this hypothetical scenario, and Mike, if you would turn over control to Ron to discuss some training ramifications.
Thank you, Bill. Ron, let me hand it off to you here. Ron, you hopefully are good to go here.
Okay. And all right, I'm gonna see if I can't switch down.
What do you think you're doing, Dave?
Can you see the change in screen there, Mike? Did I got that all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Do appreciate it. Thank you for that. So let's real quick take a look at what enabled such an effective response at that school. And the simple answer is it was just planning, coordinating, and training. This isn't rocket science. This isn't concepts that are unheard of. They're used by professionals all over the world. If you look at what Israel does, the way they secure their children with firearms in the classrooms, this isn't something that we really have to rebuild at all. So what we're looking at here quite simply, is just doing what we know works, following a pattern that we've experienced in the past, that all professionals deal with when it comes to working against threats like this. And when we do this, if we just take a look at the individual steps, and I'll keep this fairly brief. If we look at the planning, I'm taking you now to our website in the Team Tactics Manual in Section 3. It's not very exciting. The reason I'm kind of showing you this is we go into a great deal of depth in the individual tactics manual, discussing how you would actually look at that threat, how would you look at your assets, and then how you'd start to begin to plan for that. Within that, you've heard mentioned a few times the intent to defend protocol. Again, it's not really exciting here. On the visual end, I just do want to kind of give you the look and the depth of this, and what's important to know in this side of it, in the intent to defend. Again, it's not rocket science. It's something that's been done before and in places, and what we do here within the website is give you that outline, that template, and then we give you the resources by simply allowing you to click into different portions, the team tactics individual manuals, the unit manuals, etc., etc., as well as you'll be seeing here in the next minute with the individual skills. And so one of the things we addressed in this discussion was the planning of it, the planning for the individual, what we call the individual operator in that school. And that goes to the administration, that goes to the concealed carriers, that goes then to the coordination with local authorities. And there are many practical steps individuals and teams can take. One of the things we talk about is the interactive wargaming. In this section in the Team Tactics Manual, you can see we discuss the three-dimensional tabletop exercises. We talk about the computer assisted, and then just simple board gaming, and then the all-important terrain walks or tactical exercises without troops, and then we get into the force-on-force, the reality-based training that you can work on at your facility, at your school, at your church, at your business. And as we, again, want to stress, this isn't reinventing the wheel. This is just simply doing what we know works, having seen it performed in other places for other applications. It's just really simply the planning and coordination training for the fight, which then brings us into, with that training and planning for that fight, is our sphere of influence here. And we've talked about this in the past. That sphere of influence really breaks down into a couple of different spheres, if you will. And part of those concepts are your direct sphere of influence, which is the kinetic end of that, where you can actually apply force and your presence there. And then we have the indirect, which really reaches out into a Boydian principle of increasing your interaction with your surroundings, where we're building now, increasing that interaction with local police, the sheriff's department, the police department, first responders, EMS, etc., building those relationships, building that trust through that intent to defend, through that curricula we have that shows how these things all work together, how that preparation is made, and then into the individual tactics as well. So it comes down to the fact that we always harp on of these team tactics, this coordination, all relies upon the individual's abilities to perform correctly. And the ability to perform correctly on demand, under high threat, comes from such simple and mundane things as the proper wearing of your equipment. We discussed that in the Defense Academy. We have all the weapons manipulations broken down into individual. Indeed, Mundane, just simply being able to wear your equipment correctly is important because in the case of our teachers there, being concealed, complete concealment, the idea there is no one knows, as Bill mentioned, their names are not made public, they're kept internal, they train internally, and they wearing their equipment appropriately and properly, then it's difficult to find them and point them out. We talk about that skills such as the proper chamber check and magazine check. You'll see here inside the Defense Academy, start all these out with just a simple paragraph followed by a very quick video. And then we get into very detailed explanations on how those individual procedures are achieved, how they're gone through step by step, and most importantly, we talk about the why these things are done the way they're done. For instance, the chamber check, mag check is administrative action. It's something you would do before you strap your firearm on for the day to actually go out into the community, and we would do that for the reason we call 5 seconds of cheap insurance, so we know for a fact that we have a loaded firearm, a functioning firearm, and we're ready to defend innocent lives. So as mundane and as simple as that seems, it's all very much a part of that. Stance and grip then leads to the proper stance, giving you an opportunity to actually engage someone by moving appropriately, stabilizing your platform so you can shoot, and then the grip obviously leads to the ability to be able to shoot one accurately, and more importantly being able to shoot multiple rounds at your desired targets in rapid sequence with control, and thereby eliminating or greatly reducing the probability of collateral damage, which is a real probability that the Russian attack on the schools, as well as the recent Orlando incident, shows is a very great possibility if the people aren't trained in these type of situations, in these skills appropriately. Then what we do is, you'll remember back to the hypothetical scenario that Bill showed you. In there, the teachers actually coming around corners and shooting. Those all blend into other techniques, individual techniques, such as learning how to clear that L-shaped hallway, learning what those walls would look like, what they might do, how you might use those as cover concealment in the case of this building that has concrete cinder walls, cinder block walls. Then you would be dealing with things like spalling, which is those rounds that do not directly impact you, then being kicked away from that wall, along that wall, at various angles that could still affect you even though you're not hit directly with a shot. That's a skill, individual skills you learn. You learn how to present the smallest target possible in there. A whole bunch of little individual skills that you learn that are all necessary to extend your survivability and give you the greatest opportunity to eliminate the threat as quickly as possible, and thereby not just preserving your own life, but preserving other innocent life out there as well. So there's a lot in the Defense Academy. We encourage you to go deep into that Defense Academy, and even if you never take any training with us, for crying out loud, get in here, get this information, download it, take it, use it for your own benefit, for your own family, for your business, your church, your school. It's paramount this information gets out there, and we would ask you to spread that far and wide for your benefit and the benefit of our communities and our nation. So that really kind of winds down my portion of this presentation, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn this over now back to Mike.
Actually, I don't need the control, Ron. Can you hear me first? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine, Mike.
Very good. I'm going to go ahead and mute you here until the question part. Okay, Ron, thank you. Bill, thank you. A very sobering scenario today from the standpoint of the historical event and then bringing it forward into what might possibly happen here in the U.S. As Bill pointed out, luckily, we have not had any terrorist activity regarding our schools here in the U.S. The concepts and ideas that we have presented today also directly respond to an active shooter, where obviously, unfortunately, we have had some experience. But I do want to also ask you to look forward, and from the standpoint of this being a sobering conversation, based